My name is Chris Mann, and in this video, I'll teach you how to accurately summarize Sam Harris's views and point out some of their flaws. Alright, so this is based on an interview that Kyle Kulinski had with Sam Harris on YouTube, and I'll put the address in the description box below. Basically, I assume that all views are implied until they're officially and explicitly stated on the record, as mentioned in Rule 5. So, to use actions with positive connotations is to imply that they are morally good. To use actions with negative connotations is to imply they are morally bad. And when a person does something, it implies that it's morally bad in their opinion. To do something intentionally or unintentionally needs to be reworded using the next best scientifically provable action as mentioned in Rule 3. So I'll either drop the word intentionally or unintentionally, or I'll change it to try or to not try, or something like that. Alright, so let's listen to the first clip.
I just want to take a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so, to start by telling people, for one, why I've agreed to come on your show, and just nailing down some basic facts.
Okay, so in this clip, Sam Harris is implying that it's not morally bad for person A, to tell the audience why A agreed to this interview and nail down some basic facts. So the fact that he's doing some action implies that he believes it's not morally bad. And the fact that he did the same thing at the beginning of the interview with Cenk Uygur supports my guess. Alright, so next clip.
I'm doing this interview with you now because of the interview you did with Glenn Greenwald.
Right.
And I hope people will watch that interview. And this is very much in the spirit in which I went on the Young Turks network and spoke to Cenk for 3 hours. He'd given people like Reza Aslan and C.J. Worrellman a platform to disparage me and lie about my views, and then he invited me on to clean up the mess. And that is what's happening now.
Okay, so in this clip, Sam Harris is implying that it's morally bad for person A to give person B a platform to disparage or lie about C or C's views. And it's morally bad for A to disparage or lie about B or B's views. So let me see. This was the first view he implied, and here's the second and third one. Alright. So when he seems to be complaining about some action, that implies the action is morally bad. And here he's probably using the word disparage in the same way I'd use criticize. And the word lie needs to be changed because it implies intention, as mentioned in Rule 3. So I changed these to: it's morally bad for A to give B a platform to criticize or say untrue things about C or C's views, and it's morally bad for A to criticize or say untrue things about B or B's views. So I'm going to delete these versions, and here are the replacements here. Alright, next.
I'm not saying you did this cynically. I'm not even saying Cenk did it cynically, although that's probably giving him a little too much credit. I'm not saying...
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad for A to cynically give B a platform to criticize or say untrue things about C or C's views. Now note that he uses the word cynically in the same way that I'd use intentionally. And everyone uses and defines words slightly differently, so it's important to take note of the way each person uses words and translate them into words that will cause the least confusion later. So he seems to be implying that doing it intentionally would be morally worse than doing it unintentionally, and therefore, of course, it's morally bad. But I have to drop the word cynically so that it becomes: it's morally bad for A to give B a platform to criticize or say untrue things about C or C's views. so I put that here, but this is really just a restatement of the second view. I'll just delete that one.
Glenn came on your show and just ran me down for the better part of an hour. Okay, he misrepresented my views, as he always does. He compared me to neo-Nazis. He's known in his capacity as a lawyer. He called me a coward. I told the world that I change my views whenever people find them offensive, and then I falsely claimed to have been misrepresented. And you more or less agreed with him on that point, and we'll definitely get into that. Um, and now I'm responding to all that bullshit.
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad for A to give B a platform to run C down, misrepresent C's views, compare C to neo-Nazis, call C a coward, say that C changes his views, and falsely claims to have been misrepresented. Alright, so here Harris is defining what he meant by disparage or lie, and he seems to summarize what Greenwald did in the previous interview as running him down. But based on what I've heard so far, there's a better way to summarize what he did, and so I broke it up into two parts. It's morally bad for A to give B a platform to misrepresent C's views or criticize C or C's views based on misrepresentations of C's views, and it's morally bad for A to misrepresent B's views or criticize B or B's views based on misrepresentations of B's views. So I'm going to delete this version here. So here's my summary of what he's saying there.
And so before we get into my views, and again, I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about, I want to take a few minutes to just explain some background facts. And
Okay. So here he's implying it's not morally bad to explain some background facts. And so I put that here. But this seems to just modify one of his previous statements. Uh, so it seems to modify this one. So and then you combine them together, and it basically becomes it's not morally bad for A to tell the audience why A agreed to this interview and explain some background facts. So explain some background facts, I think, is a better way of saying it than nail down some basic facts. So I'll just delete this version here.
because it's very easy for people to get confused about what's happening here, and you appear to be confused about what's happening here.
Okay. So here he's implying it's not morally bad for A to tell B that B appears to be confused. All right. So again, the fact that he did this implies that he doesn't think it's morally bad, and he would disagree with people who'd say it was rude or disrespectful. And of course, I disagree too because those things are not scientifically provable. So I put that one here.
Now, you make an effort to be scrupulously fair in your interviews. It's a very obvious effort. You really wear your heart on your sleeve there, and you make an effort to be unbiased. And this is a very good thing most of the time. But it's not such a good thing when you're dealing with unethical and irresponsible people.
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally good to be scrupulously fair and unbiased, except with unethical and irresponsible people. So I'm not sure there's a difference between scrupulously fair and just fair. So I'm going to go with the simpler choice. And I always translate unethical to immoral or morally bad. And because irresponsible has a negative connotation, it's basically redundant. So this is going to simplify to it's morally good to try to be fair or unbiased, except with people who do morally bad actions. So I'm going to delete this version here. Okay.
And if you came upon two people fighting in an alley, you wouldn't necessarily assume that each has a good reason for trying to hurt the other. And but in the area of public debate, everyone seems to assume that there must be two valid sides to every argument. I mean, certainly an argument taking place between reasonably well-known people like Greenwald and myself. But
Okay. So in these clips, he's implying that it's not morally good for A to assume that both B and C have good reasons to attack each other. And it's not morally good to assume that there are two valid sides to every argument. Alright, so in this case, good and valid seem to mean logical. So I'm going to change that to logical and combine these statements. And I'm going to end, let me see. So I'm going to combine these statements and they'll become it's not morally good for A to assume that B and C have equally logical views or reasons. Let me delete these. But the problem with this is to assume breaks rule 3. So it would have to be changed to say or to claim. But then the resulting view breaks rule 2. So it must be discarded completely. And so I'm just going to erase this one.
that's not always true. Okay, some people are in fact total assholes. Okay, they're unscrupulous, they're dishonest, they're self-serving, they're powerfully self-deceived, they're narcissistic, they're unwilling to admit mistakes. I mean, some people are just walking case studies in psychopathology and bad faith. Now, unfortunately, I have managed to collide with a fair number of these people. And Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan are probably the most well-known, but they have their minions. I mean, Glenn has Murtaza Hussain, who I think is probably a psychopath, given the way he behaves online. And Reza has Nathan Lean, who, from my eyes, just aspiring to be the most ethically confused person on earth. And then there are people like Chris Hedges and C.J. Worrellman. I mean, these are both famous plagiarists and loons. But
Okay, so here he's implying it's morally bad to act like an asshole, act unscrupulously, act dishonestly, act self-servingly, act powerfully self-deceived, act narcissistically, act unwilling to admit mistakes, act like a psychopath, act in bad faith, act ethically confused, act like a plagiarist, and act like a loon. I changed the wording of these to make them sound more like volitional actions as mentioned in Rule 5. But in the absence of definitions, most of this just seems to be name calling or ad hominem attacks and not scientifically provable. So uh, it's as if Harris is trying to change his opponent's minds by calling them names, which would break Rule 1, although it's possible that he considers what he's doing to be criticizing or discouraging his opponent's morally bad actions. Uh, so only two things seem scientifically provable and worth keeping. So I put them as it's morally bad to act unwilling to admit mistakes, and it's morally bad to act like a plagiarist. So I'm going to delete this here.
many people assume that criticizing the character of one's opponent, as I'm doing now, is to commit the ad hominem fallacy. It's not. Okay, that's only true if you're failing to deal with their arguments. Insofar as any of these people have arguments, I've dealt with them. Many people.
Okay, here he's implying that it's not morally bad for A to criticize the character of A's opponents after dealing with their views. So this clarifies what he thinks he's doing. Uh, so he's using ad hominem attacks after refuting their views, after dealing with their views. So even though he didn't use a fallacy, and even if he doesn't think it's morally bad, it breaks Rule 1 in the way that I intended Rule 1 to, you know, yeah, it breaks Rule 1. So if you've pointed out the logical flaw in your opponent's argument, why then add that he's acting like a loon? Now, just think about how strange it would be if that were the one thing that caused your opponent to change his mind. And it would be strange because he would have changed his mind for an illogical reason and broke Rule 2. So, anyway, I put this one here. Yeah.
Now, but you are engaging with these people as though they are arguing in good faith. Now, they aren't, and my correspondence with them should prove that to you if you've been paying attention. Now, but you are engaging with. Now, but
Okay, here he's implying it's morally bad for A to engage with B as if B is arguing in good faith, and it's morally good to argue in good faith. So I put those here. Now, it's also possible that Harris thinks it's morally bad to argue in bad faith, but either way, what's important is that he thinks there's a way to prove good or bad faith using evidence, and that implies that to argue in good faith uh, is scientifically provable. He thinks he can define it in terms of scientifically provable actions. And at first I didn't agree, and that's why I deleted it before, but now I'm curious about his definition of the word.
you get into a conversation with him where you treat him like a perfectly moral, intellectually honest person who just might have interesting things to say about me and Dawkins and our alleged bias against Muslims. Okay. But who is C.J. Whirlman? Okay. He's a plagiarist who, when caught, rather than apologize and spend a year in the wilderness like Jonah Lair or any other person that has a scintilla of shame, he created a sock puppet blog, literally a fake blog, ostensibly from some woman in Brooklyn, through which he accused me of plagiarism. And our listeners can review how that worked out for him online. Okay, we're talking about the most unprofessional behavior imaginable, and yet you are taking him seriously.
Okay, here he's implying that it's morally bad for A to treat B as if B is perfectly moral and intellectually honest after B was caught plagiarizing and B accused C of plagiarism. So this could, let me see. So I put this here, but it can be reduced to it's morally bad for A to treat B as if B does morally good actions after B was caught doing morally bad actions. And it's morally bad to plagiarize and not apologize. And it's morally bad for A to falsely accuse B of plagiarism. So I'm going to delete this one. And here's the new version here.
I mean, I remain genuinely agnostic about Snowden. I honestly don't know whether he's a hero or whether he deserves to be in prison. I mean, I'm absolutely, it's just, there's just a blank spot in my mind about the significance of what he has done. I simply don't know the consequences of his actions now or what they will be in the future.
Okay, so here Harris seems to be reserving judgment about what Snowden did until he gets more information. So reserving judgment is different from deciding that it's morally neutral. So I just wanted to make that note here. Uh,
And you seem to assume this makes him a brilliant investigative journalist. Greenwald doesn't have a journalistic bone in his body. And
Okay. Here he's implying that it's morally good to do investigative journalism. And it's possible that he's implying that it's morally bad to not do investigative journalism. Uh, but anyway, I put this one here.
I have never seen someone so maliciously unconcerned about misrepresenting the views of his opponents. I mean, apart from the other people we're talking about here, like Reza Aslan and Glenn's deranged colleague, Murtaza Hussein. I mean, these people are glorified cyberbullies. They're not journalists, they're not scholars, and they're certainly not intellectuals. I have
Okay. So here he's implying that it's morally bad for A to act maliciously unconcerned about misrepresenting B's views. But this just simplifies to his previous statement here. It's morally bad for A to misrepresent B's views or criticize B or B's views based on misrepresentations of B's views. So, yeah, I'm just gonna delete this one here. Delete that. And he's implying that it's morally bad to act like a cyberbully. Uh, this was undefined. You know, he didn't define that here. But I'll assume that he thinks it's possible to define it in a scientifically provable way. And he implies it's morally good to act like a journalist, scholar, or intellectual. Now, the point about journalists may be redundant based on, in light of the second, this this view here. It's morally good to do investigative journalism. So he may be just repeating that here. And the point about intellectuals may be unprovable. It depends on how he defines intellectual, to act like an intellectual. But anyway, I just put those. I just put it here. And let's see.
they almost never admit mistakes, okay, much less correct them. And practically everything they put out there is a half-truth at best. Yes, for the first time, Greenwald corrected one false accusation he spread about me on Twitter, that Jerry Seinfeld business, and I saw you notice that. But he managed to do this in a totally dishonest way, and it was only after he reaped a fucking whirlwind of criticism online. That was pure self-preservation on his part.
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad for A to not admit mistakes that A made and correct them before reaping a whirlwind of criticism. So I'd say that this time limit needs to be better defined. Exactly what counts as a whirlwind of criticism. Let's see. Next.
So generally speaking, these people don't admit errors, and when they do, when errors are pointed out to these guys, they just double down.
Okay. Here he's implying that it's morally bad for A to not admit. He's implying it's morally bad for A to double down on mistakes that A made after they have been pointed out to A. So he included a grace period in this statement. So if A makes a mistake and then doubles down on it before the mistake is pointed out to A, Harris wouldn't criticize A. So this makes me think he intended to have a similar grace period in the previous statement. So so this was the previous version of that one where there was no grace period. I'm going to delete this one and replace it with it's morally bad for A to not admit mistakes that A made and correct them after they have been pointed out to A and before reaping a whirlwind of criticism. Okay.
So when I'm dealing with these people, the two sides are not equivalent. I am not lying about their views or using stupid tricks to misrepresent them. And if you ask me to restate Greenwald's view on any of the points we'll discuss, I'll be able to do it in a way that he would find no fault with. Okay, I don't have to misrepresent his views to argue against them. So
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally good for A to represent B's views in a way B will find no fault with. So I put that here.
and these people seem to think that everything is fair as long as you're quoting someone accurately. And
Okay. And here he's complaining about how they quote him accurately but without context. So here that implies that it's morally bad for A to quote B accurately without full context. And I put that here.
and if you don't notice that crucial difference, if you don't focus on how ethically and intellectually repellent that behavior is, you have lost the plot, and you are part of the problem when you give these people a platform.
Okay. Here he's implying it's morally bad for A to give B a platform without noticing the difference in how B and C represent each other's views. So noticing something is not provable, so this statement is not allowed as is, and I'd have to take the word noticing out. But this just seems like a restatement of his previous views anyway, so it can be safely ignored. So I'll delete this one.
For a guy like Glenn Greenwald, I'm not convinced that he's nefarious. For a guy like Glenn Greenwald,
Okay, so here Kyle Kulinski seems to be implying that it's morally bad for A to nefariously misrepresent B's views. Now, based on the context, Kulinski seems to use nefarious, in the same way I'd use intentionally. And so that word needs to be dropped so that it becomes it's morally bad for A to misrepresent B's views. So I'm going to delete this version here. Alright.
This man is not a journalist, and yet you are not calling him on what are just obviously shocking cases of intellectual dishonesty.
Okay. So here Harris is implying it's morally bad to act intellectually dishonest, and it's morally bad for A to not criticize B for acting intellectually dishonest. Okay. So again, to act intellectually dishonest is not allowed. There are different ways to describe what Greenwald did using provable actions, and he did that elsewhere. So I'm just going to delete these.
and I've done talks with Michael Brooks of the Majority Report in the interview with C.J. Whirlman, which you were just mentioning. The entire point of that. Now you say, well, I shouldn't treat these people serious to begin with, but the entire point of that whole discussion was for me to defend the whole concept of new atheism. So
But if you're dealing with people who are not arguing in good faith, or you're dealing with people who are consciously misrepresenting the views of their opponents, you have to call that out. You can't just you can't act like
no,
all the rules
that,
of civil discourse are being followed.
and
Okay, so here Kulinski is implying that it's not morally bad for A to give B a platform when A is trying to defend C's views. So Kulinski is trying to refute Sam Harris's view that it's morally bad for A to give B a platform to misrepresent C's views, criticize C and C's views based on misrepresentations of C's views. It's morally bad for A to engage with B as if B is arguing in good faith, and it's morally bad for A to treat B as if B does morally good actions after B was caught doing morally bad actions. But Sam Harris's response makes it clear that he wanted Kulinski to criticize B's past actions. So Kulinski's refutation failed because his statement is not really the negation of any of Sam Harris's statements. But I put this one here.
Even in a private communication with me, he endorsed Murtaza's article entirely. Okay, and he has since hired him. I mean, Murtaza is the most deranged person I have noticed online calling himself a journalist. I mean, it's just the fact that Glenn Greenwald would form an alliance with this guy tells you everything you need to know about Glenn Greenwald. Even in a
Okay, so here Sam Harris is implying that it's morally bad for A to hire or form an alliance with B, who doesn't act like a journalist. So I mentioned the word journalist here because Sam Harris called Murtaza Hussein the most deranged person calling himself a journalist. But the resulting implied moral statement would mean that only people who act like journalists should have jobs. And that seems to go too far. So, giving him the benefit of the doubt, I rewrite this one as it's morally bad for A to hire or form an alliance with B who misrepresents C's views. So I'll delete this one here.
I can't let you get away with just summarizing this as harsh criticism. If criticism is fair, if you're actually interacting with a person's point of view, that's fine. I mean, you can write a scathing book review, and I've written scathing book reviews and op-eds about someone like Francis Collins. I don't have to lie about Francis Collins's views. There's nothing I say Collins believes that he doesn't believe.
Okay, so here he's implying it's morally bad for A to describe harsh or scathing criticism of misrepresentations of B's views as harsh or scathing criticism of B's views. And this can be simplified without losing meaning to it's morally bad for A to describe criticism of misrepresentations of B's views as criticism of B's views. So I can delete this one.
My argument about torture is, again, an argument about the other half of it is an argument about how horrible collateral damage is, right? And if ever we were in a situation where the torturing someone would likely mitigate the problem of collateral damage, then that's ethically a very interesting situation because we process the horror of collateral damage very differently than we process the horror of torture, and in a way that I think ethically blinds us to the truth, which is, blowing up little kids, disemboweling little kids and their parents, and burning people who then survive with these horrible injuries for the rest of their lives. That is always worse than waterboarding somebody or depriving them of sleep or beating them up or whatever we would do in the context of, quote, torturing them.
Okay, so here he's implying it's morally bad to cause collateral damage, which is defined as to injure or kill a civilian when trying to kill a terrorist. It's morally bad to cause collateral damage after doing torture that could reduce collateral damage. And it's morally bad to cause collateral damage without first doing torture that could reduce collateral damage. And it's morally bad to do torture that could reduce collateral damage. So he's saying that given a situation where torturing someone could reduce the amount of collateral damage, it would be morally worse to cause collateral damage without doing the torture than it would be to cause collateral damage after doing the torture that could reduce collateral damage. And he seems to be implying that each action is morally bad. So I put those here.
Torture is everything. I mean, torture is deliberately making someone in your custody uncomfortable for the purpose of making them talk.
Okay. So here he's defining the word torture. All right. So he says it's to torture is for A to deliberately make B, who is in A's custody, uncomfortable for the purpose of making B talk. But I'm going to reword this as for A to make B, who's in A's custody, uncomfortable when trying to make B talk. All right.
Sleep deprivation is torture. And so the question is, are we ethically required to give members of Al Qaeda a full 8 hours of sleep every night for the entirety of their time in prison? Is that an ethical requirement? I don't get 8 hours of sleep, right? So I think the answer to that is no.
Okay. So here he's implying it's not morally bad to deprive Al Qaeda members of a full 8 hours of sleep every night for the entirety of their time in prison. So remembering the context, though, he's not saying that it's not morally bad to apply sleep deprivation to only Al Qaeda members, nor is he saying that we can deprive them of sleep for the fun of it. So I would reword this as it's not morally bad for A to deprive B, who's in A's custody, of a full 8 hours of sleep every night for the entirety of B's time in custody when trying to make B talk. And so I'm going to delete this version.
So now already you're on a slippery slope to, well, just how uncomfortable are we going to make them and for what purpose? But people don't want to talk about this. You feel like you're participating in the Inquisition of the 14th century, even going down this road. But the reality is that good, well-intentioned people who are trying to keep open societies safe have to think these issues through.
Okay, so here he's implying that it's morally good to think through torture using a sliding scale. Alright, so this isn't allowed as is. Harris seems to be lamenting that people don't even want to talk about this stuff. So my guess is he wants people to debate it. So I'd reword this as it's morally good to debate the morality of torture using a sliding scale. So I'll delete this version.
I stand by everything I've said on torture. I do think it should be illegal for some reasons I've spelled out, but there are things that are illegal which in certain cases are not only ethical, but you would have to be a monster not to do them.
Okay, so here he's saying that depending on the situation, illegal actions like torture and theft span the scale from morally bad to morally good, basically. And this modifies his previous view a little bit. So now I'm going to reword that one as it's morally good to debate the morality of illegal actions like torture and theft using a sliding scale. So I'll delete this version here so that this is the new version.
Theft is illegal, but there are situations where you have to steal something to save somebody's life. Somebody's dying in the parking lot. You run into the market to get some necessary life-saving materials, and you don't have your wallet on you. You just grab the stuff and you run back out in the parking lot and you use it and you'll pay later, right? But that's theft. That's ethical. Theft is illegal, but there's
Okay.
I just think it's more like I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think that you're basically engaging in a philosophical conversation about some of the hardest things to solve.
and
I
we
think
need
that
to do that.
liberals, including myself, I think we by and large like to focus more on, empirically what has happened with the misapplication of something like that. Like, for example, the Senate torture report, where we learned that over 20% of the people that we tortured were totally innocent
Okay,
and weren't connected in any way to any terror group.
All right, so here Kulinski is implying that it's strategically good to focus on the misuse of or failures of torture. And Kulinski is trying to refute Harris's moral view by saying he prefers to focus the debate on something else. He's expressing this as a preference, so I think he's saying it as strategic advice given the current situation on the war on terror and given the goal of reducing the incidence of torture. So you can't refute a moral view with a strategic view. So if that's what he was trying to do, he failed. But I put this as his third view here.
I'm trying to get down to ethical bedrock on these questions. I want to know what is right and wrong in situations like this, and where should the balance swing, and then we make our laws around that. I mean, we have to get the ethics straight first. We have to know what is good and evil before we can write laws and then say that we're happy that someone's spending a decade in prison for transgressing them. I'm trying to get down to I'm trying to.
Okay, so here Sam Harris is implying that it's strategically good to determine the morality of illegal actions like torture and theft using a sliding scale, then vote for laws based on that. So, yeah, I put that here. Now, Harris is trying to refute Kulinski's view by suggesting a different course of action. So I think he's also talking about strategy here. His goal is different from Kulinski's in that it seems to involve sentencing, because he mentions, being happy about or satisfied with someone who has to spend a decade in prison for transgressing the laws. Right? So Harris's strategy is to get people to agree that an action like torture is morally bad enough to be made illegal, then base the punishment or sentence on a sliding scale. And the misunderstanding comes from him seeming to say that it's sometimes morally good to do morally bad actions. So I'm going to reword this one as it's strategically good to determine if a morally bad action should be illegal, determine the punishment or sentence using a sliding scale, then vote for laws based on that. And based on this understanding, his previous moral views can be restated. So, uh, this one is it's morally bad for A to deprive B, who is in A's custody, of a full 8 hours of sleep every night for the entirety of B's time in custody when trying to make B talk, and then you give that person light punishment. It's morally bad for A. It's morally bad to cause collateral damage after doing torture that could reduce collateral damage, and you give that person moderate punishment or medium punishment or whatever. It's morally bad to cause collateral damage without first doing torture that could reduce collateral damage, and you give that person heavier punishment. And it's morally good to debate the punishment or sentence of illegal actions like torture and theft using a sliding scale. Yeah. So let me see. Delete that one. Those are the new versions here. Okay.
You're giving my opponents too much credit here. No one has ever revised their take on my view based on the follow-ups.
Okay, so here he's implying it's morally bad for A to not revise A's views of B's views based on B's clarifications. Alright, so I put that here. Next.
it's fair, I think, to say and to categorize torture as, from a legal perspective, off the table, and therefore, in terms of the public discourse when it comes to politics, that it is already kind of like a, all right, we got that one. You know what I mean? Like, you can kind of lump it off and throw it in the category with murder and manslaughter and in the don't do section.
Yeah,
so I think when people read it, and if they don't like you, they're going to interpret it in the harshest way possible and say, how dare this guy even mention it, especially given the context right in the middle of the war on terror.
Okay. So here, Kulinski seems to be implying that it's morally bad to debate the morality of illegal actions like torture and theft using a sliding scale. So Kulinski missed the point about debating punishments, and he's refuting the previously implied version of SH35 here, which was which I had before. Kulinski implies that others would say it's morally bad to even discuss the morality of torture, but I think he's talking about himself in the third person in this case. So I put this here.
But then you have to understand that if you're in a situation where getting information with someone will mitigate the prospect that you have to drop a 500-pound bomb on half a dozen people, only one of whom is a likely target, right? When the balance, when collateral damage is on the other side of the balance, then the ethical burden is on you to look closely at how these about which harms are worse.
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad to not determine if torture is worse than collateral damage in certain circumstances. And he seems to be repeating a previous view with different emphasis. So I would reword it as, it's morally bad to not debate the punishment or sentence of illegal actions like torture and theft using a sliding scale. And I put that here. But this one is unnecessary given that this one is right here. They don't both need to be there. But I'm just going to leave it like that.
Now, do I think Greenwald wants to live under Sharia law? All right, of course not, right? And he would be dead in a day under Sharia law. So, but he does not have to want to live under Sharia law to be effectively an apologist for Islamism. Now, so follow this thread here. So, Islamists use charges of racism and bigotry and Islamophobia to deflect criticism of their ideology and agenda. Now,
okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad to act like an Islamist apologist, which he defines as to use charges of racism, bigotry, and Islamophobia to deflect criticism of Islamism. Alright, so to use such charges is to criticize, and to criticize an action implies it's morally bad. So Islamist apologists like Greenwald would say that it's morally bad to criticize Islam or Islamism. To criticize criticism of an action is to imply that that action is not morally bad. And I want you to remember that if you don't criticize or discourage an action at all that you believe to be morally bad, you are acting hypocritically. So anyway, I'm going to reword this one as it's morally bad to act like an Islamist apologist, which is defined as to criticize people for criticizing Islam or Islamism. So I'll delete this version.
we have liberal cartoonists who get murdered by people screaming, "We have avenged the prophet," and the far left blames the cartoonists for their insensitivity. And Glenn Greenwald did this, right? And so, I mean, this is who you're dealing with. He saw
all, point conceded. If you, as I've kind of mentioned in some other segments I've done, if somebody basically buckles on civil liberties and the non-negotiable things because they fear offending one group or another that's a minority community, then I agree with you that is I would consider that regressive.
Okay. So here, Harris is implying it's morally bad to punish criticism of Islam with death. So the cartoonists were criticizing Islam, so the terrorists punished them with death. And by stating this the way he did, Harris implied that that was morally bad. So that's the first thing. Then Harris pointed out that Greenwald criticized the cartoonists, and Kulinski conceded that what Greenwald did was morally bad. All right, so first I put here, this is Sam Harris's view, and then Kulinski implied that it's morally bad to punish criticism of Islam with death, because he conceded that point. And then Kulinski implied it's morally bad to act like an Islamist apologist. So I put these here.
That status quo is totally unacceptable. And people like Greenwald not only demand that we accept it, they try to destroy the reputations of those of us who complain about it by calling us bigots and Islamophobes. That status quo.
Okay, so here Harris is implying that it's morally bad to claim to accept the status quo that Islam is the only religion you can get credible death threats for criticizing. Okay, so to accept is not a scientifically provable action, but to claim to accept is. So I just went ahead and reworded that. And I put that here. And according to Harris, Greenwald's view is that it's morally good to claim to accept the status quo, and it's morally bad to not claim to accept the status quo. Okay, yeah. Anyway, I put those right here.
There's an endless number of examples of people who have no intelligible grievance apart from what they believe to be true in religious terms. And I mean,
the Taliban who shot Malala is a good example.
Yeah, and that's so. Like, let's just drill down on this a little bit more. I mean, I'm happy to talk about foreign policy too, but I don't want to slip off the topic of Islamism and the way in which people are denying the link between belief and behavior here.
Okay. So here, Harris is implying it's morally bad to deny the link between belief and behavior, or to deny that many extremists have purely religious grievances. So I put that here.
But then he immediately goes to, but there are Christian and Buddhist fanatics too. You know, remember, Christians kill abortion doctors, right? So again, this is how he can be an Islamist apologist without wanting Sharia law. This is rank apology for Islamism, because these problems are incomparable on every level.
Okay. So here, he's implying it's morally bad to act like an Islamist apologist, which means criticize people for criticizing Islam or Islamism, or change the topic when people criticize Islam or Islamism. So according to Harris, when Greenwald mentions Christian and Buddhist extremists, he's doing so to deflect criticism of Islamic extremists, thereby acting like an Islamist apologist again. So I widened the definition of the word. Put that here. And I'll just delete this version.
Greenwald says that all forms of fundamentalism are dangerous, right? Bullshit. Okay? It matters what the fundamentals are. I mean, fundamentalist Jainism, as I pointed out 1,000 times, is not dangerous. So Greenwald on your show emphasized we have to devote ourselves to criticizing all religion equally, right? Is all fundamentalism is a problem? All religions have their extremists. Again, this is total bullshit. This is doing the work of Islamists for them.
Sam, I understand that, and it makes sense to obviously make distinctions between religions and talk about, hey, this specific belief and this specific religion leads to action X and action Y.
But that was the moral core of Greenwald's animus toward me in his interview. Okay, that was how he justified calling me a bigot. The fact that I did not criticize all religions equally.
Okay. So Harris is implying that it's not morally good to criticize all religious fundamentalism equally. So I put that here. And according to Harris, Greenwald believes it's morally good to criticize all religious fundamentalism equally, and it's morally bad to not criticize all religious fundamentalism equally. So it's unnecessary for Greenwald to say it's both morally good to do something and morally bad to not do it. But anyway, I put those two views here.
I think when a lot of people make the point that we should criticize equally, it's not to say that there aren't actual differences, but I think they're trying to make a pragmatic point about whether or not your criticism will be heard by more people. Because if people like us, given our context, don't spend a decent amount of time, and I'm not saying you haven't because you have, but if people like us, given our context, don't spend a significant amount of time going after either Christian fundamentalists or state violence via imperialism, which we could get into, then it comes across to a lot of people, specifically in the Muslim world, that you're being demeaning or you're being condescending when you focus primarily on that religion, even if you can rightly say, hey, there's more religious terrorism done in the name of Islam today than any other religion. So in other words, isn't there like a pragmatic reason to make that argument, whether or not you agree with it?
No. Again, I can only control my behavior.
Okay. So here Kulinski is implying that it's strategically good to criticize all religious fundamentalism equally to avoid coming across to Muslims as demeaning or condescending. And so I put that here. Now, I think Kulinski is talking about strategy because he's making a suggestion and implies what the goal is. The goal can be restated as to not be called bigoted against Muslims by Muslims. And Sam Harris responded with, I can only control my behavior because that goal is not a volitional action. I mean, if Muslims say that he's bigoted, that's not his fault. He can't be criticized for the way that people misunderstand him. So, for example, if Harris criticizes Christianity on Monday, Islam on Tuesday, and Judaism on Wednesday, and a Muslim somewhere only sees what Harris said on Tuesday and calls Harris a bigot, you can't say that Harris did something morally bad. And indeed, Kulinski didn't claim that Harris did something morally bad. The real issue here, though, I think, is the timing with which you're supposed to criticize the different religions. Many of the times that Kulinski and people like Cenk Uygur make a video, many of the times he makes a video criticizing Islamic extremism, he seems to add in criticism of other religious extremism in the same video just to be safe. So I can assume that he's taking his own strategic advice, and I'm going to reword this as it's strategically good to alternate each criticism of Islamic fundamentalism with criticism of fundamentalism in other religions in order to not be called bigoted against Muslims by Muslims. That may not be the best way of rewording it, but it comes, I think, pretty close.
The one thing that infuriated me watching your interview with Glenn Greenwald is when he went on and on about my saying there are tens of millions of Muslims who are far scarier than Dick Cheney, right? Tens of millions, he said, like as though that just was revelatory of my depravity, right? So like Dick Cheney is this mass murderer, and I'm saying there are tens of millions who are Muslims or who are even worse than him, right? The one thing. So we're talking about 2%. We're talking about 32 million people. Yeah, 2%. Find me an opinion poll of the Muslim community anywhere on the scary questions. You know, do you think people should be killed for leaving the faith? Do you think Sharia law should be imposed everywhere? Find me an opinion poll that reliably produces less than 2% in favor of the most draconian, most medieval practices. You won't find it. 2% is 32 million people. So yes, there are tens of millions of people in the Muslim world who have a vision of life that is far scarier than Dick Cheney's. And the fact that Glenn Greenwald can demagogue this issue in the way that he did in your interview with him just proves that he's not even following what's happening in the world, right? He doesn't care to know what we're up against. So we're talking about.
Okay, so here he's implying that it's morally bad to accurately quote a statistic as if it's inaccurate. So I put that here.
So back to the idea to rewind a little bit to the criticizing religions equally. Now,
Right.
I already concede to you that, and I think if you were to press any of your critics on this, I think they would also concede, because it seems relatively obvious that, yeah, the doctrines matter, the difference in doctrines matter, and you can make judgments about this is worse for this reason, that's worse for that reason, so on and so forth. Now, I actually think that the late Christopher Hitchens had an interesting response to you on this exact point in the Four Horsemen dialogue that you did.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said is, I think that they are latently equally dangerous. And, you know, because you were laying out the case very similar to what you said here, that, you know, we should probably get rid of this liberal PC myth that all religions are equal, this and that. And he said, well, actually, I think that they're latently equally dangerous. And he went on to explain that he thinks that because any sacrifice of reason at the altar of dogmatism, plus mixed in with the tribalism that comes about as a result of religious ideology, you know, out the other end comes, okay, yeah, there may be differences. At any given time, we could say religion X or doctrine X and religion Y is worse for this reason and that reason. But overall, it's not really an unreasonable thing to say that they're latently equally dangerous. So,
Okay. So here Kulinski is implying that it's strategically good to criticize all religions equally because all religions are latently equally dangerous. And this is similar to what Kulinski said before, but this time fundamentalism is ignored and the goal is less clear. The goal seems to be to reduce the danger posed by all religions. But what exactly counts as danger? Danger. So, yeah, is it violence or just a disregard for science? Uh, anyway, I put that here. Let's see.
The reason why dogmatism is latently dangerous is because it leaves you unresponsive to reality. So
Right,
if your dogma is all life is sacred, all human life is sacred, equally sacred, and you can never harm a human at any stage, that seems like the most benign thing in the world. But then enter embryonic stem cell research. Now you got people thinking that blastocysts in petri dishes can't be harmed, even if you're going to save people with Alzheimer's and full body burns.
Right.
That becomes a situation where the dogma that seemed benign gets you needless human misery. So I'll grant that point, but no, they're not all. It's trivially easy to see how you could improve any of these religions ethically, and Jainism simply does not have the potential to become to spawn a death cult of suicidal terrorists. It just doesn't.
Yeah, I think
So here, Sam Harris is he grants that all religions could equally lead to a disregard for science, but he doesn't grant that all religions could equally lead to violence. Uh, this is more of what I would call a scientific view. But anyway, moving on.
In terms of criticizing Islamism and jihadism and being, aggressive about that and whatnot, which is, obviously, I think any rational person should do that. And I tried to lay out in my interview with Glenn how I prioritize morally which things I should spend time on or not.
Okay, so here Kulinski is implying it's morally good to criticize Islamism or jihadism. And I put that here.
I think that Glenn's response on that point was reasonable when he says, well, context matters. So for you or me to spend a lot of time, or more of our time or whatever, criticizing a group to which, in the United States, they're a minority and they're more of a persecuted minority, it comes across wrong. And when we waged the war on terror and we've been responsible, whether on purpose or not, for the deaths of many Muslims, the context of us doing it comes across much different than the context of somebody from the Muslim world doing it, like Majid Nawaz.
Okay, and here Kulinski is implying it's morally bad for non-Muslim Americans to criticize Islam more than other religions, given the goal of not being called bigoted against Muslims by Muslims. So he's basically repeating what he said before, but he's aiming his advice more at Americans. But I put that one here.
Is this what you were calling the Chomsky doctrine? The idea that you should
the Chomsky rule, the idea that you should criticize your government first because you're responsible for the actions of your government.
Okay, so and therefore, and then the top spin that Greenwald gives to that is, if you're not doing that, and if your focus is elsewhere, that is kind of a very telling sign of jingoism and tribalism.
Okay, so here Kulinski implies that it's morally good to criticize one's own government first. And according to Harris, Greenwald would agree with that one and add the top spin that it's morally bad to not criticize one's own government first. So again, according to Harris, Greenwald holds both views, which is unnecessary.
Or they're worried about the overuse of the masculine pronoun in academic writing, right? but I mean, literally, right? I'm not straw manning this.
Right? No, I know. I've seen it.
and I mean, there are probably whole conferences about that stuff, and yet when girls in Afghanistan are getting their faces burned off with battery acid, right? They say it's none of our business. Who are we to judge, right? Who can say what is right or wrong? Okay,
to be fair, though, what percentage would really say that's like none of our business, or who are we to judge?
Well, no, but it's implicit in the fact that my focusing on that summons cries of bigotry from people like Greenwald, right? It's a sign of my bigotry against Muslim barbarians that I'm more worried about the mistreatment of women in Afghanistan than I am about the misogyny in my own culture.
Okay, so here he's implying it's morally bad to act like a misogynist, which means to overuse the masculine pronoun or burn girls' faces off with acid. And according to Sam Harris, Greenwald would say it's morally bad for A, to focus on criticizing Islamic misogyny instead of on misogyny in A's own culture. So I put Harris's view here and Greenwald's view here.
But I try to make clear that there's a difference between actual bigotry and somebody who's criticizing ideas and they're concerned about. Basically, what you're concerned about is, when it boils down to it, conservatism, ultra-conservatism.
But yes, but the people like Greenwald and the true Islamist apologists, the Muslim Islamist apologists, make every effort to blur the line between those two things. So Greenwald knows I'm not a bigot. He has to know I'm not a bigot at this point, and yet still he's talking in his interview with you about my focus on Islam being a sign of my jingoism and bigotry. And so, I mean, to take this is another example of how he is in fact an Islamist apologist. I mean, so consider the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, right? This is an odious organization. This is an organization that has explicit ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. It attacks Ayaan Hirsi Ali as a bigot and gets her blacklisted from universities. It does nothing but blur the line between Islamism, this creeping theocracy I'm talking about, and the legitimate concerns for civil rights that you just described, right?
Okay. So here he's implying it's morally bad to misrepresent criticism of Islam or Islamism as criticism of Muslims. So I put that here.
I mean, imagine a hostage situation, right? You have a terrorist who has taken hostages, and he's begun killing them, right? And now we have the police show up, and they put a sniper in place, and the sniper is told to shoot the terrorist before he kills any more innocent people, right? Now, unfortunately, in this case, the sniper misses his target, and he hits and kills another hostage, right? Now, how do we analyze this situation morally, okay? Intentions are everything in this context, right? The sniper is trying to save lives. Okay? If he could capture the terrorist and put him on trial, he would, right? But he can't. So he's attempting to do the only thing that will stop him from killing more innocent people. Now, by the logic of people like Greenwald, he's just another murderer, right? Forget about his intentions. He killed an innocent person there, right? And God help him if he's white and the victim is black, right? Then we'll never be able to think about this in a rational way, because then he must be a racist, right? This is just moral insanity.
Okay. So here he's implying it's not morally bad to unintentionally kill a civilian when trying to kill a terrorist. And so I put that here. But this needs to be reworded. And it becomes, it's not morally bad to kill a civilian when trying to kill a terrorist. Because I had to take the intention out of it. But then, this contradicts what he said before, when he said it's morally bad to cause collateral damage. But this contradiction can be resolved by rewording it. So I'm going to reword it as, it's morally bad to kill a civilian when trying to kill a terrorist, and then you give that person light punishment, or something like that. So I'll delete this one.
Take a messier situation, what just happened in Afghanistan. We have the bombing of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, right? I don't know how much you were paying attention, but
no, I was all over it. I got to do a news show. I got to cover that stuff.
So liberals reacted to this. I mean, the one I noticed was Abby Martin. I don't know if people know who she is, but
yes.
She's another person who attacks me as a racist and Islamophobe, and a psychopath. She reacted like, this is, we have. She reacted. The only way to make sense of her reaction is that she believed that the new plan now was to intentionally murder the people who work for Doctors Without Borders, right? One of the most beloved charities on earth, right? The new plan now is that we are going to kill these doctors and nurses and their patients because it does something good for our side and we just want to do it, right? Not that this was a tragic accident. I mean, this is so obviously, one, it's obviously a tragedy, but two, it is so obviously bad for us. The idea that we would have intentionally done this is crazy, right? Now, what is the difference between intentionally having done it and not having done it by accident? That difference is enormous.
Okay. So here he's implying that it's morally bad to claim that American soldiers intentionally killed the people who work for Doctors Without Borders. Now, the intentional part of this could not be based on scientific evidence. It's not. Intention is not scientifically provable. And debating soldiers' intentions would break Rule 3. But I'm just going to put that one here. He also implied that it's strategically bad to intentionally kill the people who work with Doctors Without Borders. And that needs to be reworded so it becomes it's strategically bad to kill the people who work for Doctors Without Borders. All right.
But it is enormous because intentions are the only indication of what someone is going to do if they get the chance to do it. It's the only indication of what someone would do if they had the power to do anything they want, right? And so this is how this again. You called this theoretical. Like I actually think that is a term of disparagement, right? This is not theoretical.
I didn't mean it that way.
Well, no, but it was people will take it that way, right? Like it's not really in contact with reality. This is just what you say at a philosophy.
No, I just mean it as in we haven't lived in a world where Osama bin Laden has had equal power to Dick Cheney.
Yeah, but we know. But people are telling us ad nauseum what they want to do, right?
Which is why I'm saying I grant you that point, but I think it's also we have to, for accuracy's sake, say that Dick Cheney, in fact, is responsible for more deaths, even than some monsters who have worse moral beliefs.
But it is
Okay. So here, Harris is implying that it's morally bad to dismiss hypotheticals or describe hypothetical situations as theoretical. And when Harris mentions that the terrorists often declare their intentions, well, that's a scientifically provable action. And you could reword the statements that involve intentions to, you know, you can replace to intentionally do something with to declare one's intention to do something and then do it, or something like that. So that would be okay. That wouldn't be against the rules. Anyway, I put this one here.
Now let me dig deeper because I have an important point to make in terms of. So let's talk about this intentions thing because I think it's a spectrum. I think for you and I to discuss it as if it's like, well, it's either good intentions or bad intentions, like it's a black and white thing, I think is much more complicated than that. And I think that when we talk about the history of the U.S., it's not like, and you may disagree with me on this, and I'm very curious to see what your take is, it's not like, and I think it's been proven historically, the U.S. isn't primarily concerned with altruism and humanitarianism and bringing freedom to people. I think that the reasons we do what we do, specifically when it comes to foreign policy, it has more to do with power and control and geopolitics and imperialism and having a hold on natural resources. And like I said, I think the primary effect of that is that you see something like American exceptionalism or neoconservatism manifest as a kind of militaristic fundamentalist religion. And I can go through a litany of examples of this that I think prove my case. Like if we're really concerned about freedom and bringing about the right values all around the world, well then how could we, for example, arm and support Saudi Arabia? How could we have armed the Syrian rebels who are outwardly Islamist? How can we have armed the Mujahideen? And the list goes on and on. Now,
Okay. So Kulinski is implying that it's morally bad to discuss intentions as if there's no spectrum between good and bad intentions. And of course, again, so you can discuss intentions. Discussing intentions is one thing, but debating the morality of intentions is another. So I'm gonna reword this to make it better. It's morally bad to not debate the morality of declared intentions using a sliding scale. So let me delete this one.
Greenwald supported the war in Iraq, right? This is is he guilty of imperialism? Is he guilty of wanting to destroy Muslims or to commit genocide?
Well, certainly, if he was in the government and he made that decision, I would probably say yes.
But we're just human beings working in situations of risk and massive
I'm saying that your average person doesn't know everything that the person in government would know, and all the information would be necessary. You know what I mean? In order to make a decision.
No one had all the information, and who knows who was being spun by Chalabi? And the truth is, most people, even most people who were against the war, thought there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? I mean, so there was a case to be made against the war, even if you thought Saddam Hussein had biological weapons and chemical weapons and was working on nukes.
Okay. So Kulinski implies that it's morally bad for a country's leaders to act like imperialists, and it's not morally bad for a country's civilians to support their leaders who act like imperialists. But these are double standards, so they're not allowed as is. I'll delete these ones. And I replace them with, it's morally bad to act like an imperialist, and it's not morally bad for A to support B who acts like an imperialist. Okay.
I think the least moral stance a person can adopt here, though it seems ethically pristine, is the stance of Gandhian pacifism. And I unpack that again in The End of Faith and elsewhere. I think if you think you are impeccable and you haven't gotten your hands dirty, if you're a pacifist, you look a little. Okay, no, but I'm just saying that a lot of liberals think that's in a truly impregnable position, ethically speaking. When you get into the details, you're just letting. I mean, what pacifism is just a willingness to stand by while your children are raped and murdered by the Morlocks, right?
Right.
And so if you're not going to use violence ever, I think you're kind of a proper moral imbecile.
So this actually.
So we admit there are certain circumstances where you need to use violence, and then. Now we're debating about when violence is justified,
right.
And
I want to finish on that. I want to do.
I think.
Okay. So here Harris is implying that it's morally bad to act like a Gandhian pacifist, and it's not morally bad to use violence in certain circumstances. So he seems to be saying something similar to what he said about torture, except now he's talking about violence that's not morally bad enough to be made illegal. And I'm going to reword this to make the similarity more explicit. So it becomes, it's morally good to debate the morality of violence in certain circumstances using a sliding scale. Let me delete this version.
The left has always had the virtue of self-criticism and self-doubt, right? So on the left, it's always been a virtue to wonder, what if I'm wrong, right? Like, what if my opponent has a point? Now, that really is the core of intellectual honesty, and the left has had it more than the right? But the Greenwalds of the world, and I would argue the Chomskys of the world, have perverted this impulse. I mean, rather than maintaining a healthy capacity for self-criticism and self-doubt, this has morphed into an ideology of masochism, where we are always wrong, where America is always to blame, and that it's all blowback.
Okay. So here he's implying that it's morally good to self-criticize, self-doubt, or ask, what if I'm wrong? And these need to be reworded so that they're scientifically provable. So it's morally good to claim to self-criticize, to claim to self-doubt, and to ask, what if I'm wrong? Okay, so I delete this version.
Yes, blowback is a real phenomenon, and so what lesson should we draw now? We should know enough now not to arm Al Qaeda in Syria, right? Great. That's what we should do. That's
and
the lesson.
Petraeus didn't learn that lesson either. I don't know if you saw that article.
No, okay, but so let's learn that lesson. But the rest, okay, the rest is pure masochism and delusion. Yes.
Okay, so here Harris is implying that it's strategically bad for country A to arm Al Qaeda in Syria. Or you could say, it's strategically bad for a person to vote to arm Al Qaeda in Syria.
So I think that the only rational justification one can give for violence is very simply self-defense. So
okay, well, what about Rwanda?
Okay,
so we should
I'll get to that.
watch.
I'll get to that.
Right.
But so based off of that, I often say, well, the only time I'd use U.S. force is when there's a direct threat of attack against us. It's an imminent threat, and I need to use it for self-defense. Now, I think that's a rational standard. I think that's the same standard we expect of Greenland and Australia and everybody else in the world, but we kind of skirt that. Now, to get to your point of Rwanda, my only caveat, my only hedge to the idea of non-interventionism is that when there is a clear example in the world, and granted sometimes it's hard to know when this is happening without a doubt because the world is messy, but when there is a clear example of some sort of a genocide, I'm totally fine with and I'm on board with an international movement where we all go together and we all take care of the issue.
Okay, so here Kulinski is implying it's not morally bad for country A to use violence against country B for self-defense, and it's morally bad for country A to intervene in country B unless country A is trying to prevent genocide with international support. So yeah, technically these are double standards and they need to be reworded in terms of actions individual people can perform. So uh, I'm going to delete these two and replace them with it's morally bad for person A to vote to use violence against country B for self-defense, and it's morally bad for person A to vote to intervene in country B unless person A is trying to prevent genocide with international support.
And that's why I think the foreign policy I lay out of non-interventionism, I think it makes the most sense, and that's why I get really mad at the U.S., because when you look at how much we spend on military, when you look at all the countries we're involved in, and then when we end up killing so many civilians, I think that harms us, and I do think that makes people hate us.
I would agree, and it's a terrible problem for which we need some global solution that we don't yet have. It's obviously not the UN. Certainly not the UN when you put Saudi Arabia at the head of the Human Rights Commission, right? So yeah, but if we had more power, if good people had more power, which we hope that someday they will at a global level, if we could have institutions that enshrined our best ethics and our better judgment, we have to figure out what those ethics are and what they commit us to.
And that's why I
Okay, so here Harris is implying it's strategically good for country A to determine what its moral views are and what they commit country A to, then vote for international laws based on them. So, yeah, I put that here. And it would be better to reword this in terms of an action that individuals can do. So, it would be strategically good for person A to vote on what the international laws should be, basically. All right, and that concludes this video.